All right, welcome. This is session 3, Federal Grant Management, Reporting and Compliance. Just to let you know, once again, my name is Gadi Kapadia. I'm here from the UIC School of Public Health, and I will be helping facilitate and present some of the content for this session. Again, very similar to how your previous session went. We will have some presentation, an opportunity for Q&A, as well as discussion. So the goals of this session is to help you understand if your nonprofit is ready to apply for a federal grant, that it will be administered by the city. So federal funding will come to the city, then to the applicant. We will be sharing some federal grant terminology and systems. So the ideal audience in this room are those who have been a delegate agency, already identified a delegate agency for a city grant, but are not yet in a federally funded grant program. Again, we will present some content. We have some time for discussion, and then I will be sure to leave as much time as possible for Q&A. What I ask is everyone, please feel free to enter any questions you may have in the chat, and that's where we will be taking the Q&A from. Once again, if we do not have enough time for all the questions, this session is being recorded, as well as the questions and answers. We will compile a full list and share out after today's summit. So today's topics will consist of explaining the difference between a sub-recipient and vendor contracts. Again, some language around uniform guidance, grant project and budget monitoring, costs that are allowed, disallowed, the importance of records, maintaining them, retention, the difference between capital equipment and expenditures, and then a little bit about reporting and compliance. I believe, Alexis?
Yep. So often, I think some of you might have heard earlier on Jay say that, the sub-recipient, aka our nonprofits and different agencies who are applying for grants from the city to administer programs, we typically refer to them as delegate agencies. And this is helpful also because when you're looking at grants from the federal government, technically the city is the recipient of the grant. And so you guys are the sub-recipient or the delegate agency, or you might be a contractor, which often is referred to as vendors. So just know that those terms are sort of interchangeable for each other. Delegate agencies are treated a little bit differently, and their contracts are a little bit different than what a vendor contract would look like, or a contractor contract. So something really, really important, any funds expended by a delegate agency are sort of subject to effectively the same policies, procedures, and requirements as the city is. So basically, you'll see that we're requiring information like how you're going to procure contracts if you need to have some sort of equipment, or if you need to have some sort of supplies, or if you are administering a program and you have some sub-recipients or your own delegate agencies who are administering the program, that sort of contracting and the procurement procedures that you are required, or that the city is required to follow, you are also required to follow. Usually those will be referred to as sort of flow down requirements, but you are subject to audit. There's certain program monitoring that takes place with departments. They will come in and kind of make sure that all your policies and procedures are correct and that you're administering the grant in the way that you proposed in your contract, in your RFP. So many of these sort of requirements that you'll face as a delegate agency, like audit and program requirements, et cetera, those do also typically flow down to vendors as well. Specifically, a lot of the time what you'll see is there are things like procurement for vendor contracts as well. Often you'll also have Davis-Bacon, which means that you have to pay prevailing wages. There's a lot of different requirements that kind of depend on what sort of program you're administering. And those requirements, they are, in short, pretty extensive, is how I would describe it, which can be pretty intimidating. But given the fact that many of you who joined, we had recommended people who might have already had experience administering city policy, or sorry, city funded sort of grants or programs. The good news is we have structured the city's policies and procedures for our local funds and other funds to reflect also what is required by the federal government. So while those policies and procedures are very, very extensive, what you'll find is that they pretty much match any sort of requirements that you have had over other grant programs that might have had different non-federal source agreements. So that's good news. You probably have a lot of experience and policies in place that kind of satisfy what the city is looking for federal awards as well. I think the main difference is really sort of like the audit, the program audit requirements. So every year, because the city receives a significant amount of funds from the federal government, we go through what's called single audit, in which auditors will come in, they'll look at some specific programs, they'll pull financial records, and then they'll make sure that the program activities match the financial records, and that those financial records and activities match the intent of the grant. So this is something that is unique to federal funds. The city doesn't really audit programs that are funded through local funds. So that's kind of where the distinction might lie for you guys. Next slide, please.
Thank you so much.
So there are a lot of pieces that you can kind of look at to see what is the distinction between a delegate agency and a contractor. I will say again that like the city typically delineates the type of contract in the RFP. And then you'll also see that in the contract itself, it'll state like you are a contractor or a vendor carrying out these activities. This is also kind of reflected in our financial system, which as the budget office, this is where I kind of see it. But we technically have two separate types of appropriations or types of contracts that go to your subrecipient or your contractor. Some ways that you can kind of think about, am I a delegate agency or am I a contractor, are obviously listed here. But the way that I would think about it is like, if the city has, so I was in the community sort of services program where we heard from the Department of Family Services, from CDPH, Chicago Department of Public Health. So we heard from them about these different RFPs that were going out. What you might have heard was like talking about, you know, we're trying to do reentry workforce development, right? So that sort of RFP that goes out will be framed as, we want to hear from you all what sort of workforce program you would implement around these parameters. And so when you have kind of like a opportunity to propose a pretty open sort of program that might be, you know, any sort of workforce development work that you've already done, that kind of fits more into the delegate agency. So we're asking somebody to administer some sort of program, and we're kind of giving you the freedom to propose and give us, you know, what do you think works best? What models have you used that work best? That sort of freedom and free range over what the program content looks like, that usually fits into the sub-recipient or delegate agency side of things. You kind of have some programmatic control and discretion over how it's carried out, but you'll obviously also have requirements from the department that says you kind of have to meet these goals. We want to hear your reports on these things, and we're going to monitor the work that you're doing. But there is a little bit more freedom in terms of how you're administering the program. I usually think about it as like you are carrying out a program on behalf of the city. For your contractor or vendor sort of agreements, this is typically if, for example, the city needs somebody to execute the construction of, I don't know, a new building or the construction of the pop courts. If you've kind of been following along the recovery plan, there are these public outdoor plazas that are kind of temporary. And so if we have to do any sort of construction work on that, then you are kind of executing a very specific plan that is already laid out by the city. Then that's when you're kind of considered on the contractor side. You might also provide goods or services. So if the city needs, like, I don't know, to buy software, right? Like, then you're providing a very specific good or service for the city. So think about it in terms of like, you're providing something very specific that we're asking for, that's usually contractor, or you're providing services that you have a little bit more range over, that's really the delegate agency side. Yeah, so these are sort of just some of the very extensive requirements that are part of managing federal funds. Again, the city really does align its policies for all grant making that we do with what the federal government requires. So you already should feel very prepared when you look at these things. I think that what's helpful, so the uniform guidance is very, very extensive, and there's a whole history of like, here is how we need to administer our grants, and here are regulations and rules around how to do various things. And it was all a bunch of like separated out legislation that they all put together and created and called the uniform guidance. It is super accessible via the web. You can look it up, and I'm sure that they have this as one of the links that they'll provide later, but it's usually referred to as 2 CFR 200, and then those dot and numbers after are sort of different parts of that regulation. So there's a lot of language that you can spend some time looking at. I think what would be helpful is the sections outlined here. So pre-award requirements and then post-award requirements. So pre-award is really going to be what the city is doing in the background in order to make the delegate agency selection. Post-award, there is quite a bit that the city is going to be doing, but then also quite a bit of work that you're going to be doing. So if I look at record retention, right? That's both on the city side and on the delegate agency side. You have to retain your records for a certain period of time. Usually it'll be listed in your contract, / it should. And it depends on the grant program. For example, ARPA, which is the federal source of funds for the Chicago Recovery Plan, we have to retain our records until 2031. That's the last time that we can be audited. You'll also kind of see there's the same requirements. Most of you are probably familiar with that. You have to register your organization on sam.gov. This is a requirement for general contracts with the city. This is also aligned with what is required for federal requirements. Yeah, there's a lot to look at. I would say take the uniform guidance and all these sections. These are going to be the most helpful sections, I think. So definitely refer back to them. You know, the audit requirements are going to be super helpful in just making sure that you are prepared and set up for success when accepting federal funds, or as the city is a pass-through organization for those federal funds. And I think the only thing that's not on here that I would say is helpful is the procurement section of uniform guidance, just because it's going to delineate when it really does need to be competitively bid. And I cannot remember what section that is, but I would say also procurement is a really helpful one to look at. Okay. So there are other sort of parts of receiving federal funds that are important. You can kind of spend some time looking at these ones as well. I won't go into too much detail. There are also parts that are like the Davis-Bacon Act, which requires prevailing wage. And in some cases, the federal government might list these out, or they might exclude them from the federal grant. However, when you get these sort of terms and conditions excluded from the federal grant, then you have to look at state policies, and then you have to look at city policies. So if, for example, they waive certain requirements, but then the state ones there are state requirements that aren't waived, you have to follow those state requirements. And so I think what's really helpful in preparing for these types of funds is also just referencing your department and not being afraid to ask questions like, I want to be sure that I understand as I'm executing this project, here are my questions. Does this act apply? Do I have to do anything in terms of, I don't know, like policies and procedures that I need to have in place as an organization? That sort of feedback from the department of just making sure you're clear on what flows down to you and what requirements you have to follow can be really helpful. What I've noticed is that departments recently have started doing a little bit more onboarding to get you guys, to get any organization sort of familiar with, here's kind of what flows down to you and things that you should be aware of. Okay.
Right. Hey, honey, can we move to tomorrow?
Okay, all good. I think, I can't remember, sorry, I know that we switched back to your slides at some point, so feel free to interrupt me, but you'll see in your contract packet, it is very, very detailed. There is a lot of information. I know that I'm the worst at reading the fine print when it's like, here's your privacy notice, do you agree? Highly recommend that this is one of those times that you do not ignore that and spend the time to really read through. Yeah, I think this is your slide. Sorry, am I mistaken? Rudy.
It still, it says, mine still says OBM on it.
Okay, no worries. I'm also going to pull it up so that way I can see where we are. Yes, you're right. Okay, so there are a few things that we'll have to check. So as a nonprofit organization or anybody really who's contracting with the city, what we do is a check to make sure you're in good standing with the state and with the city and with the feds. So we do our homework and just making sure that, you don't have like back taxes that are owed. There are no like violations or regulations that the organization has previously not followed. So we do our check to make sure that you're in good standing. I believe this link is the one that you can use to double check. We may also be required to ask you all for a letter from the Department of Treasury, just saying that you are a tax exempt organization or proof that you are tax exempt. I know also that this is probably similar to city processes, but you might have a letter from the IRS saying your de minimis rate or how much you are going to take as indirect costs. So indirect costs are any costs that you may require as part of personnel to administer the program. So if, for instance, you know that you may have to hire or use a certain number of staff in order to administer the program, you can go ahead and pay staff out of the federal funds. That's why on a few slides back, you might have seen under uniform guidance that you do have to have sort of time reported and documented on time spent working on the grant or working on the project. But that de minimis rate, so de minimis is like, I think it's 10% that you're allowed to take from your actual project budget to spend on personnel or indirect costing. You might also have the letter from the Treasury that says, here is how much in terms of percentage that this organization is allowed to take for their indirect cost. So just know that that might be something that you might have to submit. I'm sure you're familiar with it if you've already accepted a grant from the city, but just something to be aware of in case you haven't. Many times we'll require financial statements just to ensure that you're also, in good standing. We have capacity to administer the program. Yeah, these are all pretty standard sort of things that the city will ask for anyway. But yes.
I will just go ahead and add. So indirect rates sometimes are tapped by the federal grant. So again, to what Alexis shared, the city will then use the requirements of the federal grant to limit that in the award that you as the organization would receive. And sometimes there needs to be a back and forth if you need to go over that cap and or under that cap, under the amount that is listed. So just, I think the key is everything needs to be documented and authorized. And that's the big takeaway basically in all of these slides. So and Alexis, please feel free, I think, to jump in at any time. I know we went back and forth, but so there are registration requirements. So again, most of you, if you've done some level of applications, you have to have your business needs to be registered with the SAM, the System for Award Management. And there are renewal requirements, etc. There are many tutorials on the SAM.gov website. So if you need additional support, feel free to take a look at that. FAFTA is that all grants of 50,000 or more. Again, it's about reporting and accountability. So ensuring that you're disclosing all the information, you're recording all these metrics, and that they are publicly available for individuals to look at. Anything else on this slide, Alexis, that you want to?
I was just going to say, I'm fairly certain that, so SAM is obviously required when applying for any city grant. I would say the FATA reporting, I feel like we all have different acronyms, is not quite so much. But I do, if I remember correctly, in most RFPs, some of these questions will be asked at the jump. So we should have documentation on it. But yeah, every single grant and award that the city receives, we are required to track the FAFATA information for every organization and report it in the federal system. It's also a best practice for the organization itself. So if you are a nonprofit and you have subcontractors of your own, you should also collect this information from those subcontractors and keep it documented. That's all. And then go ahead. Yeah.
No, I actually have the next two slides as yours.
Perfect. Okay. So I think what's important here is that we will collect programmatic and financial information. Your department who is administering the program is going to require certain bits of information from you all to be reported, usually on a quarterly basis. Sometimes that information will be required to be reported through our e-procurement / iSupplier system. So where you're applying for your grant or for your funds to administer a program, that is also where you'll be submitting invoicing and submitting all of your information. Again, most of you are probably familiar, but they might also collect financial or programmatic information through that system. Basically, every single grant program has its own financial reporting system. So I am very familiar with the Treasury reporting system, which is a really great time. I have been witness to also some of HUD's grants and financial reporting portals, which are distinctly different. And I will say I'm grateful for Treasury for paying for a little bit more for their reporting, but just know that pretty much across the board, the things like the SAM ID, FAFATA reporting requirements, any sort of programmatic details that your department is collecting, those are going to our federal systems as well. And some programs will ask for information like, who are you serving and how many people have you served? How many businesses have you served? How much support has been given, etc. So just expect the department to ask for that information and be prepared to give it in a timely manner. Most of the time, they will do their best to give you about 2 weeks to respond. It might be quicker, you might have more time, but just be prepared that they're going to ask for this data and for this information at a pretty quick turnaround. If you've already done city grants, again, pretty much for each program, so for like youth programs, they will collect data for their city funded programs in the same way that they're collecting it for their grant funded programs. They'll kind of align those markers and those measures so that way you're not, submitting 7 different types of data, and they'll be very upfront about what sort of information you should be collecting. Sorry, going to the next points. I think I touched on everything that I wanted to hit on, so you are good to go. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think what's really important here on this slide, and I know we can go back and forth on talking about it, but I think what's really important is making sure that whatever you're doing out in the field, I know it sometimes has to get adapted because, the community needs are different. All of the work that you're doing in the field, if anything changes from what was proposed or what's in the contract, or you realize that something needs to change, always, always, always document and share it with the department, because we don't want you to be in a situation where the program was proposed and it's perfect and it fits everything that needs to be executed, and then there might be a slight change. The data that's collected is different. Maybe it's not being executed in the way that it was proposed, and then all of a sudden it becomes ineligible. Sometimes there's a very fine line between eligible and ineligible activities. And when we talk about things like audit and we talk about things like monitoring, what could potentially happen is you execute a program, it's determined that it's not eligible, and then you are required to basically give any funds that you were paid back to the city, because the city has to give it back to the federal government, which is a really, really, really big risk to take on as an organization, especially if you're a small organization. So I would always, always, always just make sure that you are following what you've proposed, following what is in your contract. And if you have questions or anything needs to change, please refer back to your department. We don't want you to be in a situation where you're having to kind of give back any sort of funds or for activities that have been determined ineligible through the audit, through desk reviews, so any sort of oversight organizations that are actually not the city monitoring, but the federal government monitoring. And then the same thing for your budgets, right? Like your budget should not change without approval from the department, because of what's allowable is very specific on federal funds. And I'll give it back, sorry.
No, I think you hit the major points. Most of the grant projects will have a grants manager, a point of contact for you from the department. They should become your best friend, so that you can ensure exactly what Alexa said, that as the work is happening, as funds are being spent down, they're in the right parameters, so that there are no questions or concerns into the future. And on that note, one of the things that we started out saying was that there are a lot of requirements that come down from the federal government. They are explicitly written out in the grant requirements from the funding that's given from the feds to the city, as well as from the city to the organization. There are always variances. A lot of, it's not an always, but there are certain things that are never allowed. Alcoholic beverages being one of them, lobbying, fundraising, any fines, penalties, settlements. So again, a lot of the reasons why there's a lot of work up front is to ensure that none of the costs are being allocated for these kinds of non-allowable costs, but also that you can cover, if your program requires having any of these pieces, that there are other funds to take care of that, and that there's a separation of the two. So and I think we started saying this, but document everything from start to finish. I will tell you, as someone who has been federally funded for 20 some odd years, These requests can come at any time for multiple reasons with short turnaround timeframes. It is not to penalize you. It is not to be, more of a burden, but it is because there's an accountability factor that is going not only, again, from you to the city, but from the city to the federal government. And usually they are required to share with others. And so there's a lot of players that are in the system that need to be made aware of all this information. So again, standard is 6 years. As you heard earlier, there might be requirements of holding on to that longer, depending on what the funds are being used for, what the grant is related to. There are authorized representatives, so many people have access or can ask for any of the records that are related to federal awards. As mentioned, December 31, 2031 for all ARPA funded projects. So that's quite some time from now. And, again, start documenting as soon as you can. Anything you'd like to add, Alexis? So there are, again, a lot of terms that are used by the federal government that are defined by them. And we are trying to just provide some clean definitions. Your uniform guidance will provide a lot of this information as well. Your grant application, and then if you need to go to your department to ask for clarification when you're creating budgets and the like, you can get that. But we're just these are just a few. So a capital asset or capital equipment is anything that is land, facilities, equipment, or intellectual property with a useful life of 1 year or greater. So there's a lovely chart. So again, is it something that when you purchase, it will last longer than a year? If so, does per unit the value exceed 5,000? If it does not, so a good example is just paper. Then that would be supplies, right? It is, even though paper can last for more than a year, it usually does not cost $5,000. So then that would just be in your supply budget and is not actually capital equipment. If it is going to exceed the $5,000 mark, then it does go to equipment. These are usually very large purchases. Once upon a time, printers and copiers fell in this, and now they no longer do fall into capital purchases or capital equipment because they do fall under that 5,000 mark. I don't know if there's anything, Alexis, you'd like to add. No. So capital expenditure is defined as an expense for assets or equipment that makes additions, improvements, or changes that improves or increases the value. And this is something, so again, a capital, it has a useful life of 1 year more and exceeds that $5,000. So in visual form, is it something that improves or changes your capital equipment that you purchased that extends it to over 1 year and over the $5,000 mark?
And I will say, specific to recovery plan projects, most of the time, like 99% do not have a capital expenditure if they are federally funded. If they are on the bond fund, then they might have capital expenditures. And the reason why is that if you have a capital expenditure on a project, what happens is what's called retained federal interest, which means the federal government has an interest in whatever you've purchased or improved or et cetera. And there are a bunch of rules and regulations around what that actually entails for you in terms of documenting. If you're trying to sell the piece or the capital expenditure that you have, there's a bunch of rules around it. So what we've tried to do is sort of structure all ARP funded programs not to have capital expenditures. Your bond funded projects will, and most of the time on our federally funded grants, we'll try and sort of steer away from capital expenditures, with the exception maybe of sort of the HUD grants that you might see.
again, I think one of the things about capital projects is that there are, lots of requirements and that you should be aware of them. So, I'm not going to read this list, but that if you're going out for, as we talked about, subawards or subcontracts, that you need to have at least 2 bids if you're putting money out. When you're, as mentioned before, you have to know what you're getting. So preliminary drawings, renderings, they get to be approved. Actual construction dates, initiation dates, a lot of approvals from Department of Buildings, etc. So again, these are usually long-lasting, larger products. And I agree, I don't think any ARPA funding is going to be related to any of this. Again, I think the big takeaway here is that just remember that your systems, your internal systems should be able to provide information back that meet the federal reporting and compliance requirements. So that means your employees, your accounting and payroll systems are up to par, that you're tracking your performance, that you may be audited, and that you have the ability to track all your budgeting and address that audit if needed. And there will be requirements on your end to close out these levels of grants, which will require reports and documentation.
Apologies for going long. I realize.
No, I think we're actually perfect because that is the last slide. I am going to stop sharing. I don't see any questions in the chat. I know this is really exciting information. I see, Crystal, you have a hand up. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was trying to type it, but it was going, so my typing was so slow. My question refers to the capital purchases and selling of the whatever capital items you may have. If it's not, if the agency bought whatever the item is and it's not bought by the grant itself, do you still have to follow those type of regulations if you sell the item?
So if you're not, so based on the city's model, what would happen is you'd purchase the thing and then you'd submit for reimbursement, right? If the reimbursement that you're submitting for goes to the city on a contract that's federally funded, then it's using the federal funds. If it's going on your not federally funded contract, let's say you have 2 and one you have local funds that aren't quite as restrictive, and you have another that's federal and you charge it against the local funds, you don't have the retained federal interest. You end up being in a very different sort of position, right? Like you don't have the federal government that's like, give us a % of whatever you sell or give us our money back once you sell it. So if you're not using those federal funds or that federal contract, then you're in good shape. I will say, I think it depends on the department and kind of what's in your contract specifically. I don't know. I haven't dealt with not federal funds, unfortunately. So it might be in your contract that kind of gives stipulations around, if you purchase equipment with these funds, there might be some sort of interest of the city. I'd imagine that if the project is structured such that, this is a part of your budget, it is for, let's say, business expansion or organizational expansion, then in all likelihood, you don't have to give the money back, but if you're not using federal funds, you don't have the same restrictions is the point. But okay. I would definitely consult your favorite departmental project manager.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions? Cool.
Just out of curiosity, a raise of hands, how many of you have applied or do have current federal funding that you're already working with?
Ooh.
Now I want everybody to write down their names and make them your new best friend.
Yeah.
We have another 15 more minutes. Does anybody have any additional questions or information that either Alexis or I can provide?
Maybe a question for those who have federal funds currently. What are some of the differences or similarities that you've experienced from managing sort of federally funded programs versus local or other funding sources? If you feel like speaking up and want to give some insight to the others.
I do have a question that just came into the chat. Well, but we can wait to see if anybody wants to share insight. Keith, did you unmute yourself?
My apologies. I didn't mean to do that.
No worries. There's a question about 10% de minimis indirect costs. What is the 10% applied to?
The 10% should be your overall program budget. So if you propose a $300,000 program, your 10% would then be, you can use 30,000 on personnel costs. Okay. Looks like Crystal said local takes more time to reimburse funds. It's fair. I think that so one thing that Jay was talking about towards the beginning was the sort of advanced policy. I will say, I think federal funds, we have a deadline, right? Like we have to spend the money by a certain date, and we have, usually it's like 60 days from when you have to spend to when you have to close out the program and the systems, et cetera. Usually that'll get extended, et cetera. There's a bunch that happens in the background there. But I will say, I think that deadline sort of pushes us also to be a little bit quicker in responding to any sort of reimbursements. So could be the case. Not sure. I've not been on the other end of things, but
yeah. Question here, just a point of clarification. I believe you said the de minimis rate would only relate to personnel costs. I thought that rate would apply to any indirect cost that would be allowable.
Yeah, so like if you're thinking about fringe or benefits, that counts towards that.
Yeah, or there could be non-personnel costs as well, right?
Robert, Jack, I think I have used indirects for, you're talking about like overhead costs for
Correct.
Like rent or your, your maintenance costs.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, I was thinking about like supplies, office supplies and things like that, or program supplies, which I think usually you would list out in your budget. But yeah, personnel, overhead, anything that helps you operate the program, really.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
If there is nothing else, feel free to take a 10-minute break, stretch break. I know it's been a long morning. You're gonna go ahead and you can leave the room and go back to the main room. And there is more information coming your way about additional trainings and resources that will be offered through this program. But thank you, Alexis, for your time.